Good morning. Welcome to the Wednesday, July 21st meeting of the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee. And we are all here. Councilmember Tawanda is joining us by phone for the time being. We are returning to the discussion of Thrive Montgomery 2050, the update or modernization of the Montgomery County General Plan on wedges and corridors. And we are going to get a presentation from planning today and hear from them about what's in Thrive, which is something I think everyone is eager to dive into. So without much ado, I'll ask Pam for any framing comments that she wants to make, and then we'll go to planning and we'll get right into it.
Good morning. Thank you, Councilmember Weaver. No, I have nothing. I'm just here to listen and provide them the opportunity to evaluate or elaborate on their plan for the community.
Okay, good. Well, at our last discussion, we thought this would be a helpful way to get into it, actually hearing what's in the plan and you know, getting on the table what some of the policy issues are, and give us a chance to start making, pulling together our thoughts about what changes the council might wish to make. So, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I've got Bridget Breyer here with me in the conference room at Wheaton headquarters. We've got Gwen, Tanya Stern, Carrie McCarthy, Khalid Afzal, some other staff like Lisa Gavoni, who you know, to pitch in if necessary. But I think I'm going to turn over to Gwen because, as you said, we are eager to dive right into it.
Thank you. And if we could pull up the PowerPoint presentation, I'd appreciate it. I do want to again recognize the staff who are here, our core team, which included Tanya Stern, which includes Tanya Stern, Khalid Afzal, Carrie McCarthy, Bridget Breuer, and then a number of subject matter experts. And if you have questions on different topics, David Ansbacher from Countywide Planning and Policy and Transportation, Lisa Gavoni from Countywide Planning and Policy and Housing, and Maren Hill, who was very involved with a lot of the outreach efforts as part of this plan. So the way we've organized this presentation is to just sort of talk to you first about how Thrive was created, to provide some background into the thinking that went into the creation of the document. We have some information for you about the transition from the working draft to the planning board draft. And then we have a detailed discussion about the actual recommendations in the document, the vision for growth that this document lays out. And so with that, if we can have the first slide, please. So about 3 years ago, if you could go back one, thank you. About 3 years ago, we started thinking about Thrive. The council put this in our work program and gave us a very, very specific timeline during which they wanted to have this work done, and we were working to achieve that. We developed a basic framework with three major big picture goals or outcomes: environmental resilience, economic health, and community equity. You can see how those have been a part of the discussion from day one. They are at the heart of Thrive, and we are going to be talking more about those as we move through the process. Next, please. One of the things that I would like to emphasize is that Thrive is based upon literally years of research and studies that built one upon the other and contributed to the recommendations in Thrive. So, this was not something that was done lightly. It was not something that was not done without a great deal of analysis, thought, and review by the council. You have received and reviewed pretty much all of these studies and documents over the last several years. Again, we do have staff available who can delve into what was sort of the focus and what were the recommendations and what was the direction in each of these studies the folks who are on this call from planning have the knowledge about all of that. But what I again want to emphasize is when you do a general plan in a mature community, it is not a matter of wiping the slate clean and starting anew. For example, in the DC comp plan, no one would suggest changing the L'Enfant plan for the District of Columbia. Yet you modernize, build, react to current trends, and make recommendations that, again, are based upon that foundation. Again, like in DC, the L'Enfant plan, for us in Montgomery County, the Wedges and Corridors plan. And so all of the studies and things that we have been doing have led us to this point. And I think that's really, really important to understand. This is a culmination. It is not a change in direction or a brand new, pulled out of thin air idea. This is a culmination of a lot of work, a lot of thinking, a lot of trends, a lot of demographics, a lot of direction from the council that we've received over the last several years. Next, please. When we embarked upon the study, we did a lot of work before actually going out and meeting with the community and doing outreach. We met, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to say on your last point, as I had said at one point earlier, Thrive is also the natural summation of the planning work that we've all been doing through master plans. And it is a step back and a rewrite of the bigger vision that we've been building from the ground up through master plans over at least over the past 10 years, as we've been shifting towards a corridor strategy with urbanization as a, primary goal. So it's more than the studies, although the studies have been a crucial element. But we've been building this master plan by master plan. And I think in a way you could say that what we've been trying to build isn't really consistent anymore with what the general plan is. And that's why we need to update the general plan so that what we are actually building is consistent. So, okay, thank you.
So when we started Thrive, we did a lot of background work. We went to the National Center for Smart Growth and had multiple meetings with them to talk about their regional scenario exercises that they've done. We met with all of the surrounding jurisdictions to understand what they were doing, and quite a few of them either had recently done updates to their comp plans or were in the midst of doing updates to their comp plans, which I will also mention. Most of the work on several of them is being done during the pandemic, and they are approving plans during the pandemic. So we coordinated with them on their growth strategies. We met with the Maryland State Office of Planning to make sure that we were going to be extremely consistent with all of the requirements of the state's Planning Act. In fact, after our last work session, we received a contact from the State Office of Planning basically saying, if they can help in any way or reinforce the fact that they have coordinated with us, they're glad to do that. And if you want to hear from them at any upcoming meeting. We spoke to the American Planning Association to identify general plans that might be similar to ours. I think Khalid Afzal talked about that a little bit at the last meeting, and we looked at many, many, many other general plan updates and comp plan updates to learn from them. We went back and looked carefully at the COG forecast extrapolated to 2050, made sure that we, continued to be comfortable with those growth numbers, and we are. We did conduct some scenario modeling exercises for our transportation recommendations. And again, David Ansbacher is here. He can delve into that if you wish. We would actually prefer to hold off on that until we talk about the transportation recommendations in the document at an upcoming work session. But we did want to tell you that we did a very detailed study with consultants FAIR and peers to look at these different kinds of scenarios. Next, please. We also, I want to emphasize the level of internal and external coordination. This was not a document created by one or two people. And sometimes, you know, as I was going through the process, I sort of kicked myself because of that. Most of the jurisdictions, and we learned this from going around and talking to them, hire a consultant. And they basically have the consultant do a lot of the outreach, the research, the writing, and we took a different path. We basically tried to, in terms of the both the outreach and the work of writing recommendations, we used our own staff in the planning department. I called it, you know, that we were doing this plan sort of in a grassroots from the ground up kind of way in terms of planners. We had over 60 planners in the department at one point working on this. We had, I believe it was 8 working groups and a steering committee of staff working to think about and develop recommendations on each element. We had a technical advisory group of 27 representatives from county, state, and regional agencies that met multiple times over the course of the development of the project to understand, to raise comments, to you know, offer input. We have an interagency department head meeting that happens, it used to be quarterly, I think it's probably more like twice a year now, which is all of the department heads in the county, plus high-level representatives from MCPS, from Montgomery College, from WSSC, and we presented this project several times to that group as well. I think you know already the planning board had not only its hearing, but there were 9 briefings to the planning board before our public hearing. We had 85 speakers. We had then 10 work sessions at the board. With the PHED and council, I want to reiterate what I said last time. One of the things that we really committed to was bringing the council along as we developed this plan so that we could hear early on if you felt like we were going off course, if you felt like we weren't addressing what needed to be addressed. And to that end, we did 5 separate briefings with the PHED committee and council, in addition to just mentioning our planning efforts during our semi-annual, which we always do, but we did 5 separate briefings. You all had 2 public hearings and 2 work sessions so far, with more to come. Next. One of the things that I'm actually very proud of is our equitable engagement strategy. We set out from the get-go to figure out how to reach out to people who have not typically been part of the planning process. We have a great communications team, and they came up with a strategy that included, as you can see, you know, webinars, mailings, content marketing, which are those images on bus shelters and on buses, and lots of meetings. Next, please. As we mentioned, we had over 180 meetings with members of the community. We did a survey, which we called the Thrive Montgomery 2050 quiz, and we had over 1,600 people respond to that. We sent out, I'm sorry?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know how else to interrupt you other than sort of shouting. I'm sorry. It's
sorry, no, that's fine.
I just wanted to comment here. I think it would be useful to consider having a nice summary of the community engagement part in the plan. I know you've given us an appendix document, but appendixes don't always get the attention that they could. And, you know, it might speak to the nature of how we do planning in the county and the role of the planning board generally to engage in a very in-depth community engagement process in this plan, and to highlight that, in the report itself. I don't know if it's a chapter or if it's just an extension of an existing chapter, but this is
we debated
a suggestion that came to me
Yeah.
from a community planning leader who, I thought it was a constructive idea.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I appreciate that. We debated going one way or the other, and I think that that's great to hear the idea of actually including it, in the document. Again, in a condensed form, we have the whole appendix, which is multiple pages. We don't want to add all of that to the document, but in a summary or a condensed form, absolutely. Again, 91,000 postcards to equity emphasis areas. That's not 9,100. That is 91,000 postcards. We had over 42,000 views.
If I could chime in on that, Gwen, what's on a postcard? I mean, that's obviously a large number. It's a good number. We got 1 million people, but that's a significant number. What is on an equity?
You see
emphasis
the
area
postcard on the screen. That's actually that blue box is an image from the postcard, and it was both in English and in Spanish. One thing we've done, and we'll talk about that, is really try to put all the materials from this effort into multiple languages, including translating the entire plan into Spanish, which I think is the first time in the county, and maybe, in talking to other planning organizations, we haven't seen another group who has translated the entire document into another language.
When I just wanted to let Bridget just say a couple words about that, because she was in charge of that whole process and can address some of the specifics that Councilmember Jawando was asking about.
Yes, Bridget Breuer, Communications Chief, for the record. Councilmember Jawando, we did 2 different postcards. The postcard that's seen on this screen was to encourage people to take our meeting in a box meeting, basically do it with their own community groups, homeowners associations. The 91,000 postcards that we sent to equity emphasis areas, the call to action was really to get people to sign up to testify at our public hearing. And we did that in English and in Spanish. And we also had the digital component of that as well. So that was the call to action for that 91,000 postcard mailing.
Got it. And you talked about, you had 75 people testify. I think I heard Gwen say, had a response.
85, yeah.
85 out of the 91,000.
I mean, I don't know how often we do public hearings, but I will tell you, I can't remember, except maybe for the Bethesda plan, in the time I've been here, another public hearing that had that many people signed up. 85 is a large number of signups for a public hearing. I don't know how many you on average get for council activities and issues, but
yeah, we had about 100 for the two, between the two for this topic so far. Did you track the geographic, racial, ethnic diversity of the people who testified?
We have gone back and tried to do that, and we can share that information. I don't know, Khalid, if you have that. I mean, sometimes, again, those issues are not absolutely clear-cut. And I think, went back and tried to do our best estimate on that. Did you have a chance, Khalid, to do that for the planning board hearing?
Yes, I have a rough list of planning board and council, and we can provide you that information. Majority of them, as expected, from more down county, mid county, and then fewer from up county people generally. But we can give you an estimate of that. actual from public hearings.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I just want to emphasize that it's not as though the only direct communication to the planning board was via the testimony. There are a lot of people sent us emails and communicated in other ways, in addition, of course, to the 180 meetings that we held with civic associations, with community groups, clubs, all kinds of different organizations. And obviously we're interacting and communicating back and forth directly with members of the community. So 85 is just the number of people that decided they wanted to come speak, speak live directly at the planning board hearing, but there were many hundreds, if not thousands of people that were communicating directly with us back and forth over the course of this process.
Yeah, we estimate, it's right at the bottom of the slide, that we probably have communicated through either meetings or virtual and live meetings of probably around 12,000 people. That does not count the number of people who viewed our website or got our e-letter, but in terms of actual meetings, both live and virtual. Next slide, please.
Before you go on, I just wanted to add to this conversation. I mean, in my 10 years at the council, I have always viewed my job as trying to assess who testifies in land use discussions and how representative of the community are those voices, and how are we speaking to the whole community's needs. And historically, this entire arena of policymaking has been dominated by homeowners, and largely white homeowners. And I think many of us at the council have very consciously said, we are trying to make a decision on behalf of everyone. What Councilmember Joando is raising here, I think, is it would be useful for us to formalize a mission at the planning department to build a broader participation. And I know that you try. I wonder if there is a explicit, goal that should be part of your work.
Well, I think it is, actually. Yeah. And if we could...
I'm not trying to say you aren't. Believe me. I'm saying you're doing a good job. I'm just saying, should we as a body say that is something we want to spend more effort on, like community academies to build participation and like all of these things, and that way we're taking a long view here, and we're able to ensure a fuller participation. So, I think we always have to hold ourselves accountable to who shows up. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that this arena of policy has historically been of interest to a small group of people, and they participate very intently. And the job of the policymaker is to try to take the big view. And so that's really what I just wanted to say.
And we appreciate that, and we appreciate the efforts that we have seen everyone in taking that big view. If we could go to the next slide, please. The one thing I want to emphasize is that we did an enormous amount of outreach to sort of underserved communities. And this is just a beginning of a list of some of the groups we met with. One of the things I want to emphasize that is not an issue of race or geography, but is age. We made a very specific effort to reach out to young people. We made an effort to reach out to people who we believe will be the future leaders in 2050 of this county. And one of the things I was very proud of, if you go back and look at the list of speakers that you had, both at the planning works public hearing and at the council, is you had a much larger number of young people speaking about the future of the county. And that was something we felt was really important. The picture you see in the lower right is a meeting that we held with the Gandhi Brigade of young people telling us what they thought about the future of the county. Now, they didn't necessarily come and speak at the public hearing, but they spoke to us, and we incorporated their thoughts and concerns and input as we developed the document. And, you know, I think that one of the things that is a message in Thrive is that we need to begin to think about what the county is going to be for that next generation. That the world, and I've said this in previous meetings, it's not a matter of planning for change. The county has changed in terms of its racial makeup, its demographics, and in a whole variety of ways. And we need to be listening to new voices, younger voices, frankly. And I'm old, so I'm in the group that we're on our way out. We're listening to the younger voices, and it was one of the reasons we involved so many of our planning staff. We wanted to involve our younger staff people who live in Montgomery County neighborhoods, who are making their homes and raising their families in these communities. So, I mean, I think if you go back and look at all of the speakers, you'll see a very clear age split amongst the speakers. And we're happy that we got a lot of those younger people involved during the process and also speaking during the hearings.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I personally briefed and have had several meetings with the recent SMOBs, with Nate Tinbite, with Michael Solomon, with Zoe Tashev, with a lot of leaders of not just young adults, but even teenagers, because I personally believe young people are the most underrepresented group in all of our government processes, and certainly young people of color in particular. But I think that too often the kinds of people who are engaged in these processes, it's not just that they're older, whiter, more affluent homeowners, but we miss the opportunity to reach out to the people who are going to be affected by our decisions long after we're all gone. And I personally have taken that very seriously throughout this process. And I believe that I'm proud of the fact that as a planning board chair, that I personally have really reached out directly and had one-on-one meetings with many high school, community college students, the people who are going to be affected by this, who are usually completely disregarded in these processes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I want to chime in on this slide. I think this is a good point to make this point, a good moment to make this point. This is a great list of great organizations that do really great work. I'm a former co-chair of the African Affairs Advisory Group. I've got a lot of connection to a lot of things on this list. One of the things that I think we need, two things we need to do a better job of going forward is capturing what and representing what came out of this, right? So, you talk to these groups. I think I might have attended one of these sessions. You give the presentation, a couple people make comments, what's the back and forth, what is said, and then how is that actually incorporated into the plan? It's nice to hear that it was incorporated in some way, but how is that represented? Reading the document, and I've done it several times, it's really almost, there's no way to know how that was represented and what was said, and particularly from underrepresented groups. And so I think, one, building that out in some way and reflecting that in the document would be helpful, but also having a defined list of groups that we know we're going to go to every time, and there's some, to Hans's earlier point, that there's a formal mechanism to engage with these groups in an ongoing way. That over time, because, civic engagement's a muscle, you build it up and you get groups more into engaging on these types of, weightier issues that traditionally they haven't been engaged on. So that would be my 2 points of, if there's some way to represent what came out of these and how the feedback was incorporated from specific groups, and maybe formalize the process by which, on an ongoing basis, not just for Thrive, that we hear from a certain set of groups, right? Like, for example, I mentioned last time the African American Health Program, the NAACP, both groups who had reached out to me specifically saying that, they would have been interested in speaking on this. And so I think you did great work to reach out to this set of groups, and I'm sure others. I just think those would be two recommendations going forward.
Can I just add there, as we consider maybe incorporating some of this community engagement into the full plan as opposed to the appendix, there are policy statements we could make about community participation, because it is a relevant point, right? Like, we won't be able to achieve this plan unless we have the full participation of the community. I believe that, deeply, because the resistance to a lot of these ideas, comes from smaller segments of the community. And so I think it'd be worth, putting in a few objectives for community participation, and that would fit naturally with what Councilmember Juan is talking about as well. Okay, let's continue.
Great.
This is, can I just add that we did initially, when we were doing the bulk of outreach before we got into writing the plan for the public hearing, that we do have a summary of, let's say, the big or the number of topics that came up more than others. And we can look into that again and provide you. What I remember is that housing affordability, transit access, and opportunities to jobs and access. And those are the things that, again, this is a gender plan. It's hard, we didn't want them to say, we didn't ask them, what do you think, gender plan should be? We wanted to just ask them, what do you think your issues are if you're living in the county? What do you see in the next 20 years? And even now. So again, housing affordability, transit access, education, recreation, these were the top issues that came over and over again in different formats. That is a summary of these, yeah.
Yeah, if we can go to the next slide, because we have another slide or two about, again, how we were communicating with folks. We, again, multiple language, we focused on it being audience-centric communications. What is important, again, to understand is in this county, because of the increasing diversity, there are many different languages that are being spoken. Next slide, please. So we worked to actually put information in publications that come out that are of interest to specific groups of residents in the county. I think before we started this process, I didn't even know there was a publication called Iranians Weekly, or the Manila Mail, or the Chinese Daily News. I think I knew about Washington Hispanic, but I didn't know of all these other publications. We actually took out ads, and we tried to convince them to do articles about Thrive, asking folks, how do you imagine the future? We wanted to ask open-ended questions so that we could get the kind of input that Khalid was just talking about, things that people were concerned about, that they wanted to see the county address in the future. Next, please. So the next part of this presentation is really about the transition from the working draft to the planning board draft. The 60 staff people who I mentioned worked diligently to put together a working draft. One of the downsides of having 60 people working on a document is that it does sometimes tend to read like there were too many cooks in the kitchen. And when we had the public hearing, a large number of the 85 people who testified from all different political persuasions said the plan needs to be reorganized and improved. And the board heard that, and they wanted to strengthen the plan's message and focus. They did not want to change the key concepts and recommendations in the working draft. They wanted to make it clearer, though. If we could go to the next slide, I want to just give you some literal quotes from some of the groups who testified at our planning board public hearing. Again, the theme from many of the groups from, again, different perspectives was that the plan was not well organized, that it wasn't clear enough, that it was redundant, that it wasn't synthesized. You know, when you have the Friendship Heights Coalition agreeing with Jane Lyons from Coalition for Smarter Growth, you know there's something there. Again, you know, comments that it felt like it was written by committee, that it needed editing, that it was redundant. And again, you see the names of the people who made those points, and it was something the board took very, very seriously. They agreed with the direction of many of the recommendations in the working draft, but they felt, and the community obviously felt as well, that the document needed a huge amount of editing to remove the redundancies and to make the points more clearly. Next slide, please. So here I'm going to turn it over to Casey, and he is going to really talk about the transition from the working draft to the planning board draft and how the board looked to sort of organize the important points. And I would just mention, Casey, you might want to speak loudly because it's been a little hard to hear you thus far.
Okay, I'm going to stand a little bit closer to my screen. I hope that's not too goofy, but the idea of this plan, a number of people said, well, why do you not have a chapter on the environment? That's one of the things that's come up. Or why isn't there a chapter on race? Or why isn't there a chapter on jobs? And the answer to that question is, those are objectives of the plan, which are integrated completely into every single part of the plan, every single chapter. So we felt very strongly that setting out those three pillars, racial equity, economic competitiveness, environmental sustainability, should not be an afterthought or separate topics. Those should be baked into every single part of the recommendations and every part of our thinking. And we believe that's what it means to view the world through the lens of racial equity, through the lens of economic competitiveness, through the lens of environmental sustainability and climate change. It means not treating those as afterthoughts or separate subjects, but treating them as integral to every single thing that we do in land use, transportation, public infrastructure planning. And that's why the document is organized in the way that it is. It is in no way a demotion of any of those things. In fact, I would argue, I believe very strongly, in fact, that we have elevated the importance of those things by making them absolutely central to every detail within the plan. And I think you'll see that as we work through it. Now, the other thing I want to emphasize is the way that this document is organized. It's not just there's 6 topical chapters that are all operating disconnected from each other. The first 3 chapters organize the approach to growth that Gwen had been mentioned a couple of minutes ago at 3 different scales. The first chapter, which is about compact growth, is about the scale of the county or the region. Where is the growth footprint? In general terms, where should growth occur? Where should it be? Where should it not occur? And where should it be focused? The second chapter, about complete communities, takes it down from 50,000 foot above the surface of the earth level to the 10,000 foot above the surface level. It describes the vision for communities and neighborhoods and districts. So it takes it down one level to a little bit more specific level of discussion. The third chapter, Design, Arts, and Culture, takes it down to the ground level, which is about what happens at the level of individual development projects and parcels and sites. What's going on right in front of you at the ground scale as you would experience it as a person walking down the street. So those three chapters, this is what Gwen, I think, means when she say they're nested. They're almost like a Russian nesting doll. They operate together to explain, first at the highest level, then at an intermediate level, then at a very granular level, how growth should occur and how to fill in the details as you move in through the document. Then the last three chapters define how infrastructure that's more specific, transportation, housing, parks and public spaces, other kinds of public infrastructure should support the pattern and approach to growth that's outlined in the first three chapters. So that's how the document fits together. These are not things that are separate from each other or operating, at cross purposes. They are tightly integrated into a unified field theory of how land use, transportation, and public infrastructure planning should work. And if there's one word to describe what that theory, it's urbanism. And we talk about this in the plan. Again, urbanism, as all of you on the committee know, but for the benefit of others who may not be as immersed in this sort of planner jargon, urbanism does not mean urban. Just like socialism is not about your social calendar, how many parties you attend. Urbanism is not about cities. Urbanism is about the approach to how human settlements are organized, formed, and planned so as to become prosperous, equitable, and environmentally sustainable places. And the three core pieces of urbanism that we talk about in the plan are compact form of development, mixed uses, building types and forms, and a transportation or mobility infrastructure and services that support those ideas. And the plan repeatedly returns to the idea of how those serve economic competitiveness. They make more attractive, economically vibrant places. They create more racially and socially equitable places by creating opportunities for people at diverse income levels in particular to all live and work together in the same neighborhoods and places, and also how those serve environmental sustainability goals. Those arguments are all baked into every single chapter of the plan. Next slide. So the vision for growth, as Gwen said, is keep the development footprint tight, reintroduce the growth corridors in the East County, which is important not just for economic competitiveness, but for racial equity. The East County has been dealt out over the past couple of generations, partly as a result of conscious decisions that were made by earlier generations of community leaders who had the best interests of the community in mind, but we would submit took a wrong turn back in the 90s when they wrote those growth corridors out of the previous general plan refinement. We think that's an important pillar of making sure that the East County gets the same kind of services, amenities, benefits of growth that the I-270 corridor and the southwestern part of the county have enjoyed in the past. Also, an emphasis on the east-west growth corridors and transit connections to create opportunities for the people who live in every part of the county to enjoy the benefits and have access to the amenities and services and jobs that occur in other parts of the county that, at least for today, are not accessible to the relatively more affordable housing in the eastern and northern parts of the county. Next, of course, to protect the agricultural reserve, but also to make it more physically accessible and relevant to all of us in the county. The ag reserve should not serve simply the interests of farmers or even the other people who happen to live in the ag reserve. The ag reserve is an asset for all of us. And this plan proposes to recalibrate the way that we think about the ag reserve slightly to emphasize its value, but also to make sure that that value is appreciated and accessible and enjoyed by everyone. The last thing I'll say about this is throughout the plan, we're talking about new ways of thinking about growth. Parking lots to places, complete communities, 15-minute living. This is all about redevelopment and infill as the currency which pay for the amenities, the services, the infrastructure that have been left out in previous generations of planning and development. And we think that these are the keys to filling in the gaps that exist that serve goals related to equity, that drive economic competitiveness and make us more competitive as a place to attract workers and employers. And again, also do that in a much more environmentally sustainable and benign way. Next slide. How did we, the starting point, as I said in that first chapter about compact growth, at the big picture level of the county or the region is what's the growth footprint look like? Where, in general terms, should growth be located? So how did we get from what you see on the left there, the 1964 original wedges and corridors plan, to the 1993 plan you see down there on the bottom left, sort of in the middle, over to the right, which is our proposed map. I want to, before we go into the details, just want to point out what is on that map. You'll see it looks similar to that 93 map, but it adds those East County growth corridors I mentioned, Georgia Avenue and the Route 29 I-95 corridor. And the other thing you'll notice about this that's pretty different is all those dots and also the lines between the dots. How is that different than what was contemplated in 1993? It's the addition of the idea that not only should we define the growth footprint specifically and where the more rural pattern should be preserved, but also to focus new growth even more tightly along transportation corridors and in major centers of activity. And one of the decision points you're going to have that we suggest you might want to ponder with, in some detail is, did we get it right in terms not just as general growth footprint, but the location and intensities proposed for the scale of each one of those activity centers? Do they make sense to you or do they not? That's one of the things we think you're going to want to grapple with at the future work sessions. Next slide. So, as I said, this map includes the outer area in the blue, which is the rural areas in the ag reserve, which we believe should continue to be dedicated primarily to agricultural and rural pattern of development or lack thereof. And it serves a very important environmental stewardship role by conserving that land. These areas can absorb some growth, which will occur naturally. And that's why if you see the 7 and the 2 on the map, the 7 is Poolsville, the 2 is Damascus, and you'll see a couple of the rural villages like Ashton and Sandy Spring are thrown in there. They're outside of the area that we've identified as more appropriate for as a place to provide capacity for growth, but we recognize that they need to be allowed to grow organically over time, not to expand beyond their existing footprint, but to be centers of activity and places that are destinations that serve the surrounding areas, which are going to continue to not be developed in any kind of intensive way. Hopefully, certainly not over the life of this plan. So again, that's one of the examples of a refinement or an addition in this document, in this map, that we hadn't seen in some of the earlier generations of the growth map and earlier general plans. Second, you'll see the corridor focused growth area, which is in the lightest blue, which has existing in planned transit. That's where most of the employment centers exist. And it already has a lot of the transportation, water and sewer, other infrastructure that will support additional population growth with redevelopment and infill. And that's where we're identifying as the place that should have the highest share of future growth. Next piece of that. The limited growth area is sort of in between. These are the residential wedges that were established in the original wedges and corridors plan. That's the intermediate point between those two tiers. These are mature suburban residential communities where some limited organic growth should be accommodated to meet local needs for services and provide a diverse variety of housing choices. But we're not looking to see these areas serve to provide capacity for very many of those additional 200,000 more people we expect over the next 30 years. The 4 categories of dots: large, medium, small scale activity centers, and then there's one that's at the sort of neighborhood village center scale of activity. That's the last piece I was mentioning, the dots in there that identify where are these places where growth should really be tightly focused, even within that broader context of the growth footprint. I'll stop there in case you have any questions or that's confusing. I know that's a lot to digest.
Yeah, one question I had asked in the last session, and maybe someone emailed this and I just missed it, was just a little one level down on these bubbles of what do you define, or what's the range of a large center as far as the type of the scale and size and look of development I know you have the definition here kind of in narrative form, but are there numbers? I think there was said that there was something that was behind these categories that informed them, and if you could share that.
Yeah, I think we can dive into some of that detail when we get to the work sessions, but the short answer is the original wedges and corridors plan said the corridor cities out that 270 corridor should be cities of about 100,000 people each. Obviously, we didn't come anywhere near that. You know, Bethesda, Rockville, White Flint, Germantown, these are not city centers of 100,000 people. But if you think in terms of relative scale, the central business districts like Bethesda, Silver Spring, Wheaton, Rockville, those are the larger scale centers that we're talking about. If you're talking about a medium, intermediate scale, you're talking more like, say, Olney, for example, or Glenmont. Then some of these neighborhood or village centers are things like Ashton or Sandy Spring. But we can talk.
Let me just add to that real quickly. We did not include in the definitions of large, medium, small, and village population caps, which, you know, again, as Casey mentioned in the original general plan, they said, oh, corridor cities should be 100,000 people. We do not have numbers saying large centers should be X number of people, medium should be Y number. We were really more focused on the issue of context. And I want to be very clear that this list is not necessarily all encompassing. These were intended to be illustrative of different size and context of centers. So for example, we don't have Tacoma Park mentioned on this map. That doesn't mean that we don't think Tacoma Park is a great small center. But, and we were not intending to be, and that's why there's that little tiny narrative at the very bottom of this map that says it is not intended to be all-encompassing. It is really to provide examples of scale and context. And it is not intended to offer a population limit for these different types of centers.
Right. So just add Tacoma Langley in. It's the only one that I've heard is actually missing, so I think it might assuage a little concern to add it back in.
Yeah, and I think at the work session, you know, it would be your prerogative, of course, to decide, do we have the right dots? Are they the right size? Should there be some more specificity of what they mean? I mean, our recommendation will be to keep it at an illustrative level and to encourage everybody to not read it too hyper literally. But this is one of the topics I think that will be some grist for the discussion at a future work session.
Yeah, if anything, what we were trying to show with this was that the yellow and red dots, the large and medium centers, were within the corridor-focused growth area, and that we weren't intending smaller centers and villages to be in the corridor, that we weren't intending to have, the large and medium centers anywhere in the county other than in the corridor-focused growth areas, that we would still have these smaller communities that would grow organically, as Casey described it, in the rural areas and in the limited growth area. But part of, again, the goal of this was to show that we were focused for centers in that corridor-focused growth area.
Right. Yeah, and I appreciate that, and we can get into that more in the work session. And this does represent well that general concept, and I understand what you're saying and why you'd approached it that way. I just think, you know, we just did the Ashton plan, for example, and so I have kind of some sense of what that could mean in the context of that. And obviously every area will be a little different and have its own character. I was just talking, and maybe we can talk more about like is there a range of different factors you looked at? What type of, you know, not just population, but density levels, and, you know, and we can talk more about that as we get into that section. But it is represented well of, I have the concept of what you're trying to do. I just wanted to get one level down, and we can do that as we go forward.
Right. Well, that was our objective today, is just to give you a sense of like what the thought process was.
Perfect.
Another thing that we have been trying to convey to the community, we have heard a lot of comments that some people who did not, I believe, read the plan in detail, they talked about how we are making the entire county urban, just because we are making the density everywhere. So we have always pointed them to this map to see that, no, we do not. We want to have different places, different communities maintain their character, because this list, as Gwen said, is based on what we know today, but it's also aspirational. For example, we had an internal, discussion about should Olney and Burtonsville be shown the same? Well, today they might be a little different. One, you can say one is bigger, one is smaller, but this is aspirational. It's the scale that probably will be the same. And so again, when you say Sandy Spring, Ashton, yes, we want to maintain the same scale. Its character may change. It may become the towns that are more walkable. It may have a couple of more, useful daily retail kind of things. But that's what's also shows here, that we do not want the entire county to be the same way. It's not the same kind of sprawl. Every community doesn't look the same. We do want to maintain the distinct places, characters in these places.
Is there a comprehensive list of what the activity centers are? And if so, where is that?
No, there is not a comprehensive list other than, the COG list of activity centers, which does not include any of the smaller scale ones or the village scale ones. I mean, there are official COG activity centers, and they are, it's a much smaller list, but we are not using the same definition as COG of activity centers.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues with the way COG put together that list, which, I mean, it's useful just in terms conceptually, but as far as which things were on or off, I wouldn't take that to the bank. But we could talk further about that as well.
There are a few more slides following this that help, again, explain the evolution of this map. So we might want to run through those.
Forward, I think. Yeah, so the starting point for putting together this map was, first of all, to sync up the map with reality. So to the extent that the 93 map or earlier maps does not really reflect what is actually on the ground in the real world, that's a problem. So our starting point was to try to understand where is growth focused right now? Where are there centers of development and intense, pervasive use of the land going on right now? And what you see there is the heat map. So that's sort of the starting point. Next slide.
Before we go to that, could I just ask, when we do the work session and look at the maps, that we include the growth and infrastructure policy map? But I just think it's important that we have consistency. But I just think it would be helpful. We're looking at the 93 map and then the new map as proposed. I think if we could layer in there also the growth and infrastructure, transportation policy area map, I just think that would be helpful when we have that discussion at the later work session. Thanks.
Yes, that's a great point, and I think you're going to find that if you look at growth and infrastructure policy, you look at the water and sewer envelope, you look at the state's priority funding areas, all these things wind up being pretty consistent, which is good news, that actually all these planning documents which were produced for different reasons all converge generally on the same answer as to where growth is appropriate and where it's not. So,
and you raise a good point there too, by the way. If there are other, the sewer envelope is a really good point as well. But if there are other, policy maps, planning related maps that we're using to implement ultimately master plans, then we ought to take a look at it as part of this exercise for the broad strategic vision too. So that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks. And before we go to the next slide, I just want to point out one of the additional factors we considered in where the 93 map should be modified was the special protection areas. So 10 Mile Creek, Upper Rock Creek, Paint Branch, those special protection areas have basically been, they're not exactly off limits to growth, but those represent pretty significant constraints on the development intensity. So in that vicinity of Clarksburg, the original 93 plan just kind of showed the 270 corridor going all the way out to the Frederick line. And the fact is that with the county's policies emphasizing reduced impervious cover and water quality in that area, the reality is that implies that we're not going to see the intensification of development of Clarksburg as a corridor city on the same scale as, say, Bethesda. That's just a reality. So that was one of the additional refinements that we incorporated into our thinking about how this map should be drawn. That's different than before. Next slide. We also overlaid the current zoning, and you can see some of the gaps between the 93 wedges and corridors map and the zoning that actually exists, including only, for example. Next slide. And this growth map is more closely aligned with what the zoning and master plans have done in the intervening period. Next slide. This also does a little bit of, I think, what Councilmember Friedson was talking about, showing you kind of an overlay of how this matches or deviates from other maps or ways of thinking about it. You notice that the proposal we have elevates the concept of corridors, so it's not just what's inside the growth footprint and what's outside, and it also adds Georgia Avenue, Route 29, and emphasizes those centers of activity. Next slide.
And I convinced Casey to let me include this slide because it's one that I find meaningful, because one of the things that I find hard to convey with all of the GIS maps is this idea
It's our web. It's our web.
Exactly, the web of interconnected communities, because in addition to, again, modernizing and elaborating on the idea of corridors, including the East County corridors of Route 29 and Georgia Avenue, I really think that, again, an important part of this vision for growth is the east-west connections. And, we've always talked about the east-west divide in this county, and we want to talk about how to eliminate that with corridors that connect the eastern part of the county to the western part of the county, and ways that we create a web of interconnected communities. When we debated the original framework for this whole effort, one of the, in addition to equity, environment, and economy, we talked about maybe adding a fourth framework item or idea, which was connectedness, because connectedness is what we really think needs to be on all different levels, needs to be part of the vision for the county in the future. So I convinced Case to let me throw this map back in. It's a little softer and fuzzier, and it's not meant to be, specific to like zoning lines, but it's meant to convey the idea of, that we're a web of interconnected communities. Next, please.
So where does this leave us in terms of understanding where the big shifts are? Some of this we've already covered, but I think some of this we will get into at the work sessions. First is to redraw that growth map and match the growth footprint more closely to what exists on the ground. Put those East County growth corridors back, both for racial, socioeconomic equity, and economic reasons. Focus the growth in the centers of activity along the corridors, mostly within the footprint, and strengthen the relevance of the ag reserve. That's the big picture on the on that first chapter, which is the 50,000 foot level. Next slide. To be discussed, the idea of reorienting our planning around people and not cars, which doesn't just mean emphasizing transit, walking, and biking. That's part of it, but it's all, we spend a lot of time in the transportation chapter talking about how land use should be integrated into transportation. A lot of people say land use and transportation are really flip sides of the same coin, and this plan tries to articulate exactly what that means and why, and how that is essential to build great places and reduce vehicle miles traveled, the land use is just as important as the transportation infrastructure in achieving those goals. Also, introducing social connection, social capital, and health, particularly vigorous physical activity, as explicit objectives of everything we do in planning, not just for parks and recreation. We talk about those things in the park and recreation chapter, but that the built environment heavily influences how much people connect with each other personally, socially, and it also influences how much physical activity they get and whether or not they lead physically active lifestyles, which we think is something that's overlooked in almost every other general plan we've ever seen. And we thought that that was an important addition and an innovation that we're proposing that you're not going to see in every other general plan. Also, recognizing the significance of IT infrastructure, and just like that last slide was my concession to Gwen, this one is for Hans Riemer and Nancy Navarro and all the other folks who have spent so much time and effort, I think very appropriately, focusing on FiberNet and the county's IT infrastructure, and recognizing that connection is not just about roads and transit and moving people around. It's also about moving ideas and getting people connected to ideas in a way that prepares us to compete economically in the next 30 years, and also bridges the digital divide and provides more access to people, to ideas, to education, to services, without necessarily even physically moving them. Next slide. And we want to rethink the how, not just the how much and where of the growth footprint, but the how does development occurs. Redevelopment should be thought of as the currency that we use to pay for upgrades and to amenities and infrastructure that got missed in earlier generations of planning and development. Reducing imperviousness, better stormwater performance. That's the Pike and Rose slide that we always show you, that shows how much stormwater performance is improved just by meeting the baseline standards of modern stormwater management. You reduce the amount of runoff in a 2-year storm from that Pike and Rose site by 77%. That's the byproduct of redevelopment. It doesn't require any additional environmental regulation. It requires redevelopment so we can bring existing sites up to modern standards of environmental performance. And also delivering communities that are complete and making 15-minute living possible for as many people as is practical and feasible. That doesn't mean that everybody in the county is going to be within a 15-minute walk of all the things they need to live their lives, because let's face it, there's people in this county that would have a hard time reaching the end of their driveway in a 15-minute walk. But we think that it's important to have those centers of activity, even places like Poolsville, because even though it's outside the growth footprint, if we can have a more complete set of amenities and infrastructure and services, that reduces the need to drive everywhere, allows people to park once, perhaps, reduces their environmental impact, and increases the livability and attractiveness of those places. Not to mention making them more socioeconomically and racially diverse by providing a broader range of housing options in every part of the county. And I think, oh yeah, the last one, almost forgot, the importance of design. Another idea that I'm shocked nobody has objected to this point, because people are so focused on some of the other things about missing middle housing. They've overlooked a pretty radical proposal that we should have form-based codes applied to land use planning in all parts of the county, not just in places like Bethesda or the CR zones. We think that's important to advance equity, as well as making our development process more streamlined and economically competitive. Why do I say it's important for equity? Because if you get to the planning board and somebody doesn't want an affordable housing project built next to them, they're never going to say, at least not in Montgomery County, I don't like affordable housing. They're going to say it's not compatible. And so by giving some more objective standards and specificity to what we think compatibility means, we're not throwing compatibility out the window. To the contrary, we're giving it some specific content and substance so that can be evaluated more objectively and not used as a proxy for objections to projects that are really rooted in other considerations that people don't want to say out loud. And that's why we think that form-based codes and more objective design standards are a better way to go than vague concepts like compatibility. That's something I think we are going to want to dive into in the work session and try to, tangle with. also incorporate.
Casey, on that point, I'm glad you brought that up. Obviously, one of the many concepts we'll discuss in implementing the plan is the attainable housing missing middle. And just want to point out that the approach that I took in 2007 was a form-based approach. You know, we could argue whether it's the right form, but I agree that this is an important topic for equity. So I'm glad you pulled it out, and just wanted to lift it up and say I agree with you. Thank you.
Right, and that's my Councilmember Will Juwando note. Right, I've already given one to Gwen and one to Councilmember Reamer, and there's one for you. And I think you're right. The idea of missing middle as at least at the basic level, if it meets the form-based standards that apply to a house, why can't we have multiple units in the same box? That's very much in line with your approach. So yes, we're on the same page. And arts and culture, important for both incorporated into both public and private infrastructure. That's about taking seriously the idea that our diversity is our strength, and it's something that makes us attractive as a place to do business and to live. And recognizing the quality of place is really integral to economic competitiveness. So I haven't tied every single thing here back to all three of the big themes, but I think you're starting to see where we are what we mean when we say that racial equity, economic competitiveness, environmental sustainability are integral to, not separate from, not afterthoughts, not de-emphasized in any aspect of this plan. They were considered and incorporated into every single paragraph of this document. Next slide. So our suggestion is that next time we could talk about the big picture and the three major outcomes, the introduction. Hopefully we can talk through whether you agree with the way that we framed the discussion. And then we could proceed through with hopefully 4 more work sessions to get through these chapters in a way that's orderly and provides you a full opportunity to weigh in on all the things that you would like to talk about. We'd love to collaborate with you and council staff in trying to figure out how to get into the specifics of what are those decision points within each one of those chapters. But I think you've already heard and hopefully see a little bit better how all the pieces of this plan fit together, why they do make some pretty significant innovations and additions and modifications to the land use, transportation, public infrastructure approaches that we've had in the past. And I hope this has gotten you as excited as I am about diving into some more of the details.
Great. Actually, could you leave that page up real quick? Thank you. Great presentation. Thank you. Helpful to see the highlights of what this plan presents to us and what its possibilities are. Great work. I'm sure there has not been nearly enough compliments and appreciation for you and the team. Gwen, everybody. I think there's been a little bit of a misperception that somehow this plan is not well received and that we aren't generally happy about it. I know I am. So, I know inevitably there will be some changes made at the county council. That every master plan and everything always, endures some changes at the county council. But we've got a great document here to work from and tremendous effort over the last couple of years. So thank you for that. Just to highlight this calendar, which seems like it moves us through the process effectively, we would clearly need multiple sessions at the county council as well. So, hopefully what we do through the committee will produce consensus, and there will be, council members will not feel the need to make additional significant changes at the full council. Hard to predict. But we could also have a schedule of sessions at the council where we start off with in a similar way. Essentially, you start off with the early chapters, moving through the full document so that we could potentially start in October, at the full council with the early part, even if we're still doing some wordsmithing and stuff on the later part of the plan. So just wanted to kind of, again, highlight that potential calendar. And, this looks good to me. We might tweak it. I don't know, but okay. So I guess the question is, do we want to talk about the introduction now? Pam, so that's scheduled for July 26th. So our next session is scheduled for July 26th. We're going to be going in deeper to the introduction. So comments from colleagues or others, council staff, and you can take that slide down. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the work session schedule here as laid out makes a lot of sense. I think it'd be great to get the dates associated with those sooner rather than later. I think we should be more focused on getting the PHED committee, work done. I think we can deal with the full council issues, once we get that handled and established. But I think it wasn't clear how we were going to approach this heading into the last meeting or even ending the last meeting. I think we now have a much clearer path forward if this is the approach we take. And I think this approach seems to be a thoughtful and methodical one to go through. We'll have an ample opportunity to provide input and to reach consensus on these various issues. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I just would also add, not represented there because it was impossible to be represented there, is just this idea of we're going to take the lead on the council side on the potential other forms of engagement, either focus group or a public hearing. And I'm going to share something with colleagues and with everybody. We're working on that, but I think that can happen concurrently, with that proposed, PHED committee set schedule in September. So just wanted to flag that as well.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I think it'd be great if we get the scheduled times for those work sessions as we've established and get them posted. I think there's obviously a lot of public interest in this, and I think having an understanding of we don't need packets ready, but just the broad topics that we're going to be discussing at each meeting and have that listed somewhere with the dates and times would be helpful. So as soon as we can get that done, that would be great. Yeah, and they're obviously meaty topics, so something may slide or slip, or we may need to adjust, but hopefully we can. I think that generally sounds good. I don't know if that's 2 meetings, I'm hoping it doesn't mean 4 PHED meetings a week for each of those topics. Okay, Pam's saying no, it won't be that. So I don't think any of us want that.
Yeah, I just don't think we could produce staff reports that fast.
I was just going to say you have to write the packet.
Yeah. The fastest we could do it would be 1 a week, but and you're correct, something could slip, but we could be ambitious enough to try 1 a week and possibly not have it the very first day back after recess, but the following Monday, the second PHED meeting, and then go week by week after that.
So moved.
Well, I asked Pam for a schedule of committee meetings yesterday. She's produced a draft. I think what planning is proposed here pretty closely matches to what Pam was thinking. And so we will follow up with that schedule shortly and then lay it out for the public. Okay. All right. Well, any other comments from planning? Anything else you want to share? No. Glenn, you're thriving. I can see. I now I understand what those graphics mean, by the way. That's pretty cool. The logo. Didn't notice that before.
Yeah, we wanted to explain our clever graphology.
Yes, exactly.
I'll just say briefly, I just thank you. This was very helpful. And I think I'm glad we got to this point to doing this. So I appreciate the presentation and more to come. So thank you.
I'd like to just have one discussion topic today for the rest of the day, since no one else is seeming to need to do anything else additionally. I want to ask about the anticipated time frame of the plan. It's positioned as a 30-year plan. It's been decades since we've rewritten the previous plan. But I wonder if really the pace of change generally around us hasn't accelerated so much that this actually is a 30-year plan, and do we need to think a little bit differently about general planning and consider a more flexible approach that we might need to come back in 10 years. I mean, I think we're all thinking about what is the implication of driverless cars and what's the timeline for that? And nobody really knows, and it's pretty much impossible, I think, to do any meaningful planning around that today. But it won't be impossible to do that probably in 10 years. Like in 10 years, that's probably going to be a fact. So,
that was very much top of mind when we put together this plan. And that's specifically why we declined many suggestions from the public input. Honestly, we heard a lot of suggestions that we should talk about self-driving cars, artificial intelligence, robots, what does the pandemic mean? We rejected those ideas because we believe that planning is not, even though planning is about the future, it's not about futurism. It's not about trying to look into a crystal ball and figure out what do autonomous vehicles mean. And we think that one of the fundamental errors of 20th century planning was the assumption that automobiles could, would, and should change the way we thought about planning great places and communities. That was a fundamental error that planners made in the 20th century. So it's not that we're ignoring it or think that self-driving cars and any number of other things couldn't have an impact on the future, but because we wanted this plan to stand the test of time, we declined to get out the crystal ball and think of ourselves as planners, as being people who are in the business of making grand predictions about technology, social change, the economy, and more about what are the pillars of what have made communities great and what is the experience, not just of centuries, but millennia of planning cities, villages, towns, counties, communities, places, since at least the Romans or the Aztecs, right? This plan is all about the fundamentals of what make human settlements work. And we believe, at least I believe very strongly, that it's a mistake, as the 64 plan did, to put a bunch of predictions about people flying around in helicopters or jetpacks in the future. They did that in 1964, and it's embarrassing when you look back on it that they felt the need to go out on the limb and try to make those kind of predictions. That means that this plan will endure, hopefully, because it sticks to what we know, and you could think of it as a statement about planning as much about history as it is about futurism. It's about the lessons that we've learned in the planning profession and the practice of planning over that period of time of what makes people want to live in a place, what makes them economically productive, what makes them equitable, what makes them environmentally sustainable. And those things we believe will endure, even though we do recognize that self-driving cars will change some things. So the short answer to your question is, yeah, we might need to go back and revise this plan in less than 30 years. But our hope is, and our thought process has been, how can we make sure that this plan doesn't just have to be thrown out the window the next time there's a pandemic or a terrorist attack or an economic shock or whatever the next crisis is that makes everybody say, oh, that changes everything. Because the fact is, usually those things, they do affect things like traffic and the economy and social preferences at the margin in the short term. But over the long term, what makes human settlements work hasn't changed since the beginning of human civilization.
And if I could just add also, just because we do this document doesn't mean we're going to stop planning. In fact, just the opposite. This document lays out our work program for the next decade or two of the things that we think we should study and plan for. And, you know, and you've seen it in our budget that you recently approved. We're starting to think about corridor plans that cross traditional planning area boundaries, and that, like a University Boulevard plan that might go all the way from, Wheaton to Tacoma Langley. And we're trying again to not only think differently about growth, but also to think differently about how we do that planning for growth. And, I agree with Casey. The goal of a general plan is to lay out a fundamental vision for growth. And then you're going to keep planning, implementing, revising, sometimes making additional changes. But, using my example from DC, it's not like every time you do an update to the DC comp plan, you don't open up the L'Enfant plan and say, let's rethink it. It's worked really, really well, or the McMillan plan for that matter. I mean, they've worked really, really well for a long time as the skeleton, as the underpinning for other change that takes place. And we continue to feel that the Wedges and Corridors plan does that in Montgomery County, although it's going to evolve, it's going to be modernized, it's going to be added to, as we're talking about in this document, to add more corridors and to look at it in a finer grain way, which is appropriate to the urban condition of this county, or urbanizing condition of this county. So I think that, we always can reopen the general plan. You can put it in our work program anytime you want. Luckily, I'll probably be retired before you think about doing it again. But I just don't want folks to see this as an end. I think that it's important to see this document actually as a beginning to come up with future planning efforts.
Well said. I'll turn it to you, Pam, in a second. I saw that you made one comment. Those are great responses. I think it might even be worth saying that a little bit more explicitly in the document. I like the concept of these are enduring policies that we anticipate that as much as the world changes around us, these are the core elements that will continue to be highly relevant. And so there are trends that are, we know are accelerating and buffeting us all around, but we're nevertheless intentional that we think what's in here should hold up. It's an interesting point. Pam, and then Andrew.
I was laughing that actually that's funny. The first points that's in the staff report for Monday is the question you just posed, that is, should we be planning for a 30-year horizon? And by setting a 2050 date, I just think it sets an expectation for community members when it's called our comprehensive plan to 2050. It's an expectation that we have a belief that it will last for 30 years. And just pose to the committee, something to think about as we have a society and an experience that we see more accelerated change around us related to technology, related to climate change. Things don't just seem to be changing, they seem to be changing at potentially an accelerated rate. Do we want an expectation that we believe the plan is a 30-year plan, or is 15 or 20 a more appropriate time frame? Of the plans we mentioned last week, and including Frederick and Prince George's County who've done their plans lately, it looks like most of these jurisdictions are choosing a 15 to 20-year horizon. And again, it doesn't necessarily change the policies in the plan. It changes an expectation of the fact that we recognize that change happens and possibly a need to come back at some point and do that. That's all I'll mention. And maybe we can further talk about it on Monday. It is in the staff report.
Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, be interested as we talk about it to understand the differences of the jurisdictions, because our general plan process versus like the comprehensive plan in DC, they're oftentimes compared, but they're not necessarily comparable, since the comprehensive plan in DC, for instance, is really a combination of a strategic plan and implementation document, which I do think is different. I have a tough time understanding how we set the timeline too short when the master plans that we would then use this to implement are intended to last 20 years. So, and frankly, most master plans we're lucky within 20 years if we can get something resembling what is hoped for, since they are, fairly aspirational. So I think it'll be a good discussion. I think we have to take a step back and understand it. I think, my initial reaction would be that you need to have the general plan be a longer time horizon.
Well, you just don't want to have to do this again while you're a county councilman.
Well, as long as it's 15 years, I don't think Councilmember Joando or I are going to have a problem. But I do think that there is this question. I mean, the wedges and quarters concept is not changing. I mean, that is an enduring legacy of this. I mean, regardless if they're self-driving cars or not, they'll be self-driving on corridors. It will change master plans significantly because, questions about the amount of parking that you would need, for instance, in a central business district or in an activity center, will dramatically change. The traffic pattern will dramatically change. Certain
where people live, if they can sleep in their driverless car, you could suddenly have an acceleration of people living further out. There's a lot of things like that.
Certainly, but even still, that shouldn't change in a general plan because you still would want to live in an activity center. The activity center just might be farther out on the corridor. I mean, if this is the land use pattern that we're looking at creating, we're talking about, the changes are in the implementation, that could be dramatic, but not necessarily in the broad vision. And I would argue that if a technological change is dramatically changing the broad-based vision in a general plan, then we're probably doing the general plan wrong. We're delving too far into implementation and too specifically into what is traditionally done in functional master plans, et cetera. But it's worth a discussion. I think we should talk about it. We should figure it out. But I do think that planning takes time, and vision should be long-term enough to actually implement them. And I think if we start a new general plan before the master plans that it supports are able to be implemented, then we've done ourselves a disservice and we've kind of gotten it backwards.
Well, okay. Any other comments? All right. Well, good discussion. Thanks for the presentations, and we'll see you on Monday, the 26th. All right. We're adjourned.